All right, everyone. If you guys can take a seat, we will get started with our next panel, which is the benefits of America's energy export leadership. I'm very excited about this panel because obviously America is such a leader in energy exports, and we're lucky enough to have four very distinguished panelists today. So, all right. Okay. So for this panel, we're going to start by asking Christopher, Katie, Ed, and Anne, how is your organization or company working to help deploy American resources, technologies, and products globally? And how do these exports help reduce global emissions? So why don't we start with Chris, and we can go down the line, and everyone can give a little bit of information about their organization and its role in export leadership.
Thank you, Christina, and thank CRES for putting this on and inviting me, Heather. I'm Christopher Guith. I manage the Global Energy Institute at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Most of you are probably familiar with the Chamber, but it's the largest trade association in the world. I say that not to brag, but to actually look for sympathy, but because trying to find consensus across so many members and so many diverse sectors is not the easiest thing in the world. But one thing all of our members have virtual unanimity on is free trade, and trying to lay down policies that ensure that American businesses can bring their goods and services to every corner of the world, knock down barriers to that. I mean, I'm sure we'll get into this later, but it shouldn't be a surprise that tariffs aren't something that we're particularly fond of. They certainly have a role from time to time, Russia, but they need to be very strategic, and they need to be scalpel, not sledgehammer. American ingenuity has dominated the global economy for the better part of 150 years and will continue for time to come. Traveling around the country, I'm always astonished by how brilliant the men and women in engineering and science are, and how they bring these new technologies to bear. And then the brilliant people on the finance side and the brilliant people on the construction side who actually get them up and running. And the largest division of the Chamber is our international division, and that's because more business happens outside of the U.S. than inside the U.S. And you look at expanding markets, especially in Southeast Asia and India, the sky's the limit. And it's up to us to make sure that we have the policies to get those goods and services over there as quickly and as efficiently as possible.
Good morning. I'm Katie Strangis. I'm the Vice President of Government Relations and International Affairs for the Westinghouse Electric Company. And I think I can pick up on that American ingenuity and engineering string because I think most people are probably familiar with the name Westinghouse. We've been around since 1886 in the United States, and we're one of the leading global nuclear technology companies. We export and deploy our nuclear technology in reactors globally and in the United States. And we're uniquely suited for this moment because we're providing resilient, clean baseload power, energy security and resilience, and climate are really having a moment right now, and nuclear is perfectly suited for that. So our goals and our technology, we believe, is superior in the United States, and we are deploying it in Asia, in South America, all over Europe, and in the United States. And in fact, we're very proud to have opened Vogtle 3 and 4, two large nuclear power plants in Georgia. Fun fact, those operating provide enough energy that equal to removing more than 1 million cars from the road each year. So I will stop there.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Ed Brzytwa. I'm the Vice President of International Trade at the Consumer Technology Association. We are the largest tech trade association in North America. We have over 1,300 member companies, and 80% of them are small businesses and startups, which I think is an important fact for this panel. I will also say that we are deeply dedicated to free trade, similar to the Chamber. We advocate for free and open and fair trade policies, not just in the United States, but all around the world. So we have a slightly different perspective. Our members are innovating products here in the United States that use energy. Those products are things that we use in our daily lives. So smartphones, laptops, tablets, video game consoles, monitors, televisions. That product set is growing and growing. If you come to our trade show in Las Vegas every year, you probably know this acronym, CES. That is the biggest tech trade show on the planet, the most powerful one. You will see incredible innovations, all of which are energy efficient. And this is a really key part of the story. We need, in order to solve the climate change crisis, if you believe in that, we need to make sure that the energy efficiency of these products is exponentially increasing. And by doing that, we're going to really help people lower their energy bills. We're going to alleviate the stress on our electrical grids. But when I think about exports, you've all seen the map of the globe where it's at night and the lights are on everywhere, and most of the lights are here in North America or in Europe. Many parts of the world, they do not have the same electrical grids, they do not have the same energy resources. What they need is energy efficient products or products that are decentralized from the grid. And I think that's the type of American innovation that we should be exporting to meet the demand of the consumers where they are, not necessarily where we are as a country. Because in Africa, in South America, in parts of Asia, that's the story.
Thank you. This is such an interesting panel. Thanks for having me. Thanks, Christina, and thanks, Heather, for hosting this Clean Energy Forum today. This is really interesting. So, Ann Bradbury, I'm the CEO of AXPC. We represent the leading upstream oil and gas producers. Collectively, our members are responsible for about half of all the oil that's produced in the U.S. and about 60% of all the natural gas that's produced in the U.S. So you all probably know the U.S. is by far the largest producer of natural gas in the world. We're also the leading exporter of natural gas in the world, and we are at scale the lowest emissions producer in the world. So we have one of the lowest methane intensities in terms of the production of oil and natural gas in the world, and of the countries that are about the same or lower than the U.S., we produce more than all of them combined. So when you're looking at a world that needs more and more energy, both of the renewable kind, but also of the traditional kind, the United States is where you want to get that energy from. So energy exports, especially LNG exports, is really critical to addressing climate change. So we recently supported a study that showed that U.S. LNG around the globe, even when you look at the entire value chain of emissions, is about 50% lower emitting than coal in every marketplace, or in every market around the globe. And in 1 year, the use of U.S. LNG displacing higher emitting sources of energy saved up to, or was the emissions equivalent of about 400 million cars on the road. So I love that we have a similar cars on the road analogy. So putting nuclear and natural gas together, you're really taking a lot of cars off the road. We're very proud of that. And in terms of policy, any policy that undermines or calls into question U.S. LNG or the United States as a reliable supplier of U.S. LNG around the world is only going to mean that those countries around the world that need more energy are going to look to other suppliers that are either other energy sources that are higher emitting or other sources of energy with less stringent regulations.
Thank you so much for that. I read somewhere that Russian LNG has no emissions impact. I guess that might not be true.
It's a miracle.
I know, very miraculous. Well, I guess the first question I have is for Christopher. As you mentioned, your members are in pretty much every industry and every sector. And you mentioned this a little bit, but can you kind of give us a big picture for the audience about how to think about exports? Obviously, the word free trade seems like a common thread already, but would love to hear your thoughts a bit more.
Thank you for the question. First, as somebody who represents the auto industry, can we lay off the getting the cars off the road, please?
We're pro car too.
We all need them, regardless of how they're fueled. Big picture, we're in a very strange period. I mean, we had the better part of 40 years where free trade was relatively bipartisan. And then in the last 5 to 10 years, it switched to a populist thread that is also bipartisan. It's not unilateral, but it's certainly a little bit of headwind to getting greater American exports abroad. We used to sign free trade agreements with other countries, bilateral agreements, sometimes multilateral agreements every few years. We haven't signed one in over a decade now. I mean, we're sitting here where Ann was talking about LNG. You know, the way the Natural Gas Act works is if you want to export to a country with a free trade agreement, it's an absolute must approve for DOE. We only have free trade agreements with 18 countries. And unfortunately, not many of them are huge pockets of gas demand. So we strive over and over again to try and find those consensus around bilateral agreements. I mean, you have an Asian Pacific agreement being negotiated right now. We're not part of that. Of course, the Chinese aren't part of that either. And that's really the 800-pound gorilla, because that's something that we see increasing bipartisanship, and that's skepticism, if not an outright fear of China, and utilizing trade as a cudgel to try and enforce the policies that we're hoping for. Time after time, it tends to be cause unintended consequences. I'll never understand how people can swallow that tariffs are going to be paid for by the other country. That's just not how economics works. They're paid for by Americans via high prices, and we've all seen prices skyrocket over the last 5 years, something approaching 28% across the entire CPI basket. That's a lot of extra dollars to just live. And when you have tariffs on top of that, that adds to the inflation. I do think that there are glimmers of hope. USMCA was not easy, but it represented an improvement. And also it represented an example of where populist trade policy can still ultimately be consistent with free trade. And what we have now with Mexico and Canada is something that hopefully can be a model for future administrations regardless of party. And let me add one other thing. We're talking about all the good things we export. We also export some bad things. We export NIMBYism. A lot of people look around the world and think that the grass is always greener. It's just as difficult to build things in Europe, frankly worse than it is in the United States. Canada tried to make some improvements about a decade ago, still virtually impossible. I mean, the fact that we beat Canada to the market on LNG and they still haven't opened a single LNG facility, even though they have more gas than they know what to do with, that kind of proves my point. And we're seeing this all over the world. And this is a crucial issue because we're facing it here. Obviously, our permitting system is broken, but it's broken everywhere else. And it needs to get fixed everywhere else so that we can export more things and they can buy more things and get them built cheaper and more efficiently than with these NIMBY build nothing anywhere policies.
Well, permitting is definitely a theme of the week. So appreciate your thoughts there because...
Always be closing.
I love that. I love that. So, Katie, because your company does build things in other countries, I guess for those less familiar with nuclear exports, could you explain a little bit about why it's so important from a geopolitical perspective for U.S. companies to be a player in deployments globally?
Thank you. There are a few important points here, starting with the fact that U.S. nuclear technology is the best and most advanced, and our regulatory system leads us to have the safest, cleanest, most secure operating reactors. At a time when a lot of newcomer countries are looking to nuclear energy to meet their climate goals and for more energy security, it's really important that the United States technology gets into those markets instead of Russia or China, whose safety standards and security standards are not up to par. I think it's in everyone's interest for a nuclear reactor operating anywhere on the globe to be operating in the most safe and secure manner, and that is what the United States exports. It also fortifies our strategic alliances. When a U.S.-built reactor is in a new country, it creates a relationship that lasts 60 or 80 years. It creates infrastructure where that reactor goes. It creates good jobs where the reactor is located. Also, for every reactor exported, it creates thousands of jobs in the United States, in many different states. We're not just talking about for Westinghouse, but a very diverse supply chain, some of which doesn't even involve nuclear technology, but is just manufacturing and some off-the-shelf parts. So there are many reasons why it's really important, critical for the well-being of the world to export U.S. nuclear technology.
Thank you so much. And I think I speak for everyone here that we love a safe nuclear reactor. So Ed, as you mentioned, CTA, its members, over 1,300, and they're pretty much creating the most energy efficient products on Earth. At a high level, how do you see tax, trade, and tariff policies either unleashing or hindering our ability to meaningfully export these clean energy technologies?
Well, first, I want to agree with Chris. Tariffs are taxes that Americans pay. Foreign governments do not pay them. Importers in the United States, which are companies or individuals, they pay those taxes. And if we don't understand how that actually works, we're going to miss the point on how we make our economy more competitive and how we make our manufacturers more competitive. The biggest challenge and the biggest hindrance, frankly, is that we need imports in order to be export competitive. We cannot source every single input, raw material, or component or subcomponent within the United States. That supply chain diversification phenomenon, moving those supply chains out of China to other parts of the world or to the United States is going to take a significant amount of time. So what we focused on is taking a multi-geography, team-based approach where we're working very closely with our allies, our treaty allies, and our key trading partners, our trusted trading partners, so that our manufacturers can source the inputs that they need at low costs. And that's both with respect to tariffs, but also with respect to trade facilitation measures. And by doing that, we're going to be able to compete better with China. I think export financing, particularly through the Exim Bank, is also a critical element of this conversation. If policymakers don't support the Exim Bank and give it more tools and give it what it needs to do to help American manufacturers, we're also not going to be able to compete with China. So, bigger picture, I'm really worried about the bipartisan race to the bottom on protectionism. Applying across-the-board tariffs is only going to increase prices. It's going to make us less competitive. It's going to make us more of a fortress, I think disconnected from the rest of the world and the global economy. And that's not the recipe for American exports, particularly with respect to clean tech. Because we'll be retaliated against.
Can I give a shout out to Exim Bank too? They're absolutely critical in financing exports.
We love Exim Bank.
We do.
No, and I think, with its reauthorization up, maybe, Katie and Ed briefly, what's one thing you might hope for in Exim Bank reauthorization?
First, that it happens.
Great answer.
Yes, that we have to support Exim Bank reauthorization. There's been questions in the past, but now with respect to this competition with China, and full disclosure, I am on the Council for China Competition at Exim Bank. This is one of the key tools we have in this competition with China, because they have export financing packages that they're offering to companies around the world, and if we don't meet that challenge, that's not helpful to our overall competition with China.
Fantastic.
I don't mean to be a cynic, but it's not going to be easy, reauthorization. And more than anything, it's because this administration's backwards trade policies. They have a policy in place. It doesn't get a lot of coverage, but DFC, XM, USAID are prohibited from financing any natural gas infrastructure abroad. So you have a country like, say, Vietnam, a growing communist capitalist country. It doesn't have the largest balance sheet, but it's predominantly reliant on coal. And it sees what the United States has done as far as reducing emissions by fuel switching to natural gas, and it wants to follow suit. But this policy prevents us from encouraging them to do it. So instead, they're buying coal plants from China. This is going to be a point of contention as authorization goes through Congress, and it should be discussed, and the policy should be repealed.
Just one more point on that.
I opened a can of worms,
Yeah,
but it was a good one.
We could talk for hours about this. For the reauthorization, something that my industry in particular is looking at is easing XM and DFC into understanding that we can manage and mitigate the risk involved with nuclear. This is my personal opinion, but there's sometimes a view of nuclear going back 40, 50 years and the concerns, and it's radically different from those that remember 3 Mile Island and that sort of thing. So as Christopher said, if we don't get loans from Exim and DFC, then these countries are going to turn to cheaper markets like Russia and China that can just provide everything because they're state-backed.
Yeah, the turnkey in comparison, it's very, very difficult. So I have a question for Anne, just because, Chris touched on this a little bit, but comparing American production with international producers, can you talk about how your members are working to reduce their footprint, and what innovations are we deploying successfully in terms of upstream natural gas and oil?
Sure, I love talking about this. So first, as I mentioned, the U.S. is by far the lowest emitting producer at scale in the world. It's also really important to understand that we have by far the most transparent system of emissions reporting. And so emissions reporting is still something that is sort of emerging around the globe, but the United States' reporting system, which is based on sort of a layers of both regulatory disclosures on top of disclosures that we make to investors, makes us by far the most transparent in the world. You take that and then you create a system of sort of competition among this vast array of private American producers who have incentive to continue to drive down those emissions, to attract capital, and to show the world that is looking for lower emitting sources, that we're the best. And so some of the technologies that we're deploying, first, I think this is really exciting and not something that people always associate with emissions reductions, but the drilling technology, which is allowing us to drill 3 to 4 mile laterals under the subsurface, means that there are much fewer points of emissions, much fewer surface disturbances to the land, and so allows us to produce more with less. And then you look on top of that at the technologies that are emerging, which are all coming out of the United States and some of the most brilliant minds in this space. So the technology detection and measurement industry, which really is best utilized if you look at a number of different sort of layers. So you've got satellites in space, you've got flyovers on planes, on the ground, you've got different systems of high-tech cameras, lasers. It's really incredible, the sort of ecosystem of emissions detections that the United States is deploying. We're really just on the cusp of this, but the first step is sort of showing the emissions and showing them to the world. And then the next step is continuing to drive those down. So it's actually a really exciting time in the emissions reduction business. And this is also something that as it develops and matures, we can export to other countries around the world that are also looking to continue to be big producers but want to reduce their emissions footprint.
That's fantastic. And I guess on that thread, what U.S. clean energy innovations is the panel most excited about, and how should Washington make sure that they're able to be deployed globally?
All of them.
Great answer.
The reality is we don't know what's going to work and what's not going to work, what's going to be economic tomorrow, what might be economic 10 years from now that we didn't even see coming. That's why technology neutral type policies are critically important, and applaud Chairman Wyden, Chairman Manchin for bringing the U.S. tax code into technology neutral. That's not picking winners and losers, but allowing the market to determine which technologies are economically viable. And it may not be the same in Texas as it is in Maine. It may not be the same in 2024 as it is in 2034, but it allows that type of flexibility. And since we're wrapping it up, I want to make one final point back on tariffs. This whole panel is about energy exports, clean energy exports. And if we get crazy with tariffs, then, as he said, they retaliate. And then all of a sudden, our products become uncompetitive because there's tariffs on our products. And we can't get our technology to the rest of the world and help the rest of the world, thrive economically, but also lower their emissions. So it's a triple-edged sword.
And I will make a note on time. I think we actually have a little bit more. Our distinguished next speaker is not here yet.
Thank you. Well, I can be not neutral on technology, and I can advocate for what I'm most excited about. And I'll preface this by saying I'm not an engineer or a scientist of any sort. But last week at the International Atomic Energy Agency, I was able to give a talk on the microreactor we're developing, which is a small 5 megawatt micro reactor. Is actually like a nuclear battery. It's the Avinci, it's called. And it could be revolutionary. If you look at a picture of a traditional nuclear reactor, there's cooling ponds and the big stacks that everyone is familiar with seeing, the towers. This is small. It's assembled in a factory, sort of on an assembly line almost, going back to the early days of U.S. innovation. It can be delivered to things like power for remote mining, remote villages, disaster sites, because once it doesn't need power to start, and once it starts, it operates 24/7 for 8 years. And if you use less power, it can last longer. But it is super exciting to a non-scientific person. To me, the possibilities for something like this, lunar purposes, universities and colleges, the possibilities are really endless, and it's very exciting technology.
So we represent so many different types of technology companies, so it's really hard to be biased here. But I would say, like I was talking about earlier, we need to think about the consumer in the rest of the world. 95% of the consumers in the world are outside the United States. We have a great U.S. commercial service that helps our companies export their products, find new markets, find buyers. We need to double down on that approach. It's been a long time since this country undertook the National Export Initiative, and that was under the Obama administration. I would certainly welcome that. A renewal of that kind of approach where we are working with our exporting industries to find new buyers for our clean tech in other parts of the world. And I think the Commerce Department is very much focused on this now, but we could be doing a lot more. And particularly, again, I think about products that are low energy use, highly energy efficient, even using solar in them or kinetic energy to market those products to places that just don't have the same reliable and abundant access to energy that we have in the United States.
And I might just take your question and speak a little bit to the regulatory side of it and how regulations can encourage or discourage use of a lot of these technologies that I talked about. So I actually think EPA is interested in trying to incentivize use of some of these technologies for emission detection and reduction, but unfortunately, they haven't quite gotten it right. And so a lot of the regulations that we're seeing out of EPA would actually disincentivize the use of new and emerging technologies that allow U.S. operators to better understand, quantify, report, and then reduce emissions. And so unfortunately, what you then see is that companies either use sort of some old-fashioned technology, which is costly, and then the ones, if you may have to choose to deploy additional capital on top of all that to deploy all these additional technologies, but you get no credit from a regulatory perspective. And what we want is to be able to use the new technologies for regulatory compliance, because then you'll see much greater adoption across the board, and again, a much better at accurate inventory of emissions. And so I think it's super important that Congress and regulators continue to try to get this right, to incentivize these newer technologies for greater adoption and then for greater accuracy across the board. And then I would also just put in a plug for, there's actually a permitting reform piece of this as well, because another thing that a lot of my companies want to do is electrify their operations, but they might be in parts of the country where you can't electrify. And as Chris pointed out, there's
Get a microreactor.
Yeah, well, there's actually been, I think, some conversations there, because we're looking for alternative ways to power our operations as well. They use a ton of power, and so if we can decrease the emissions of those inputs, that's really interesting too. But a command and control approach doesn't work, because what works in Appalachia doesn't necessarily work in Texas, and what works in Texas doesn't work in North Dakota, and so there has to be some flexibility built into how these technologies are utilized.
Can I add one more point on this? We've talked a lot about tariffs, but equally important is the international regulatory environment and making sure that regulations, particularly on energy efficiency, are aligned, because many markets, they may not have the most up-to-date standards referenced in their technical regulations, particularly with respect to energy efficiency, and that means those markets are going to be segmented. Now, who can take advantage of a very segmented global market? It's probably China. The United States is going to benefit more when we work with our trading partners, our key allies around the world, to make sure our clean tech regulations and our standards are all aligned with one another.
Yeah, I remember in a previous life, we had a product for Northern Ireland, other Ireland, Scotland, UK, 3 different EU products, one for Canada, one for Mexico, and one for North America. And you're making SKUs for all of that. You're creating different designs. You're doing resilience testing on all of it. So like the harmonization piece, when we can get it right, really does help, especially those little companies, be more competitive globally.
Yeah, the startups and small businesses, they cannot navigate that world. They'd rather have make one product for the whole world and sell it.
I think that is awesome if we can get there, but
It's tough.
It's very tough. It's very tough. So I guess one question for our panelists before potentially turning over to some Q&A. If you could leave the audience with one takeaway in terms of expanding America's export leadership, what would it be?
I mean, taking a step back, the advent of Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the IRA, climate provisions, clearly just the climate provisions, not the increase in corporate rates or prescription drug price controls. They've really positioned the United States to be a dominant developer and exporter of the next best technology. Right now, the International Energy Agency estimates that roughly 50% of the technologies we need to decarbonize the global economy just don't exist yet. It doesn't mean you don't exploit the 50% we have, but you can't wish or invent, or you can't wish electrons and molecules into existence. And it's the investments that are coming from the private sector, helped by IIJA and IRA tax credits, that are going to bring those technologies to bear. Things like hydrogen, which is going to be, already is, but it's going to be critically important for the hard to decarbonize sectors, heavy industry. I mean, unless we're going to go without, plastics and resins and pharmaceuticals and vaccines, we still need that thriving petrochemical sector. And it's very difficult to crack that nut as far as decarbonizing. So hydrogen and CCUS are going to be critical both here and abroad. Also, advanced nuclear goes without saying that it's going to play a role. And I think over the next 10 years, it's a little bit risque to talk about it right now, but I think we'll be talking about light water reactors again. Small modular reactors, if and when we see them finally built, they represent a huge opportunity for nimbleness. Like Katie said, I mean, it fits in perhaps a specific niche because they're at small scale. But newsflash, electricity demand is going through the roof. We need to keep up with it. We need to keep up with it while this administration is shuttering coal plants and preventing the construction of new gas plants. So if that rule stays in place, what are our options? Light water reactors are going to be there, and thankfully we still lead the world in that technology. And energy efficiency is always the tip of the spear too, but it's all going to be additive with exponential load growth happening right now. We can't shut down existing unless we have a scalable solution to replace that. You just dig the hole deeper, increase prices, and start to test reliability, which is something that is sacrosanct in this country and all developed countries around the world.
Christopher's my new favorite person because he just answered the question for me. But seriously, there's no way to reach our carbon emission reduction goals without nuclear energy. And the demand for global energy is going to grow exponentially. And you really did steal part of my answer, which is the large nuclear power plants are going to be needed. Westinghouse is working with Bechtel in Poland to construct 3 of the large reactors, and there are several under construction in China. I know that's a bad word. And we are in the process of working with several different countries as well for the large nuclear power plants, because as they increase their power needs and people want to build data centers everywhere, the small modular reactors are great. The microreactors are great. They can be combined with wind and solar on a grid as well. But the magnitude of power needed, that the big reactors are going to have to play a part in it as well. We are appreciative that Congress, this Congress and this administration have been very supportive of nuclear power. I think that we might be one of the few industries that actually has bipartisan support. So while we may have personal views on the presidential election and strong ones, we believe that whoever is the next president and next administration will continue to support nuclear energy. The ADVANCE Act that Congress passed this year was extraordinarily helpful from a regulatory perspective. It recognized that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission needs to reduce their review times, especially as there are dozens of small modular reactors in development out there. And similarly, the tax credits under the IRA are extremely helpful, but we need more. We need to maintain United States global leadership for nuclear energy. That's the message that I think everyone on this couch supports. Thank you.
My takeaway message is that we need to focus on what makes our exports competitive and what policies are running counter to that goal of increasing our export competitiveness. If we continue to enact policies that are designed to force manufacturing into the United States, that increases costs for companies, but it also invites retaliation. That would defeat the purpose of this conversation today.
So American energy exports are good for the climate, they're good for American jobs and businesses, and they're really good for geopolitical stability. So win-win-win across the board. I think to Ed's point, like, policy matters, and the LNG export approval clause, very counter to those goals. Regulatory policy that makes it, extremely expensive to produce here in America and might drive production overseas, and permitting problems that make it difficult to move product from the wellhead to the export facilities or to the markets where it needs to go, are real headwinds to achieving those goals.
Thank you so much. Well, we have a few minutes until our next speaker, so I'm going to turn it over to some audience Q&A. All right. Wow, that was fast.
Hey, so I was so fast because you guys kept mentioning Exim, so I had to say thanks again for that. I'm representing the Exim Bank. I did have a specific question for you, Katie, specifically about nuclear exports and the competition that we're facing, not only from Russia and China, but also now Korea, to a new level. What is, you mentioned the plants in Poland. What has been maybe the biggest takeaway or the biggest lessons that we can learn from the Czech bids, specifically from the issues related to Korea? That's it.
Thank you, and we do love Exim Bank. I would say lessons learned in general from Poland and the Czech Republic. The Polish deal started with an intergovernmental agreement between the United States and Poland to support the U.S. builds there, and that was critically important. And we see that in many countries, that foreign governments feeling like the U.S. government, while not supporting industry as part of the government, is supporting U.S. companies. Those sorts of intergovernmental agreements are critical, and we need more of them. It really gets things moving with the foreign governments, too. Sometimes they can be slow to move, but if we have that sort of agreement in place, then it really starts the gears turning and the wheels turning. Thanks.
Any other questions from the audience? Any from the online portal? Oh, we've got two more. Here we go. And our next speaker is about 10 minutes away, so if you guys are cool with answering some questions, we might fill the time that way.
I'm curious about the other side of it, if anyone has any thoughts about other countries exporting to the U.S., because the U.S. doesn't lead with everything. Maybe there's mining techniques from Australia, or the high temperature heat pumps that could be drop-in replacements for hydronic heating systems in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic U.S. So it may be a completely different, game, but just wondering if anyone has any thoughts on, from looking at U.S. exports and what's good, any gaps or just opportunities as far as other countries succeeding with exports here that would help decarbonization in general.
That's the cornerstone of free trade. It's ebb and flow back and forth. Sometimes it's because we value safety and worker safety in a way that other countries don't. Maybe it's more competitive there to produce it. Other countries have resources that we don't. And sometimes we're just trip over our own feet. I mean, we're still roughly 85% dependent upon China for not only our entire critical minerals demand, but we're 90% dependent upon China for the processing of those critical minerals to turn them into the magnets and other widgets that go into clean energy economy. We have more than enough of these resources to not only support ourselves, but the bulk of the rest of the world. We just refuse to permit mines. There's still this notion amongst many in the climate conversation, when you talk about mining, they conjure up, mountaintop removal in Appalachia to get coal. But that misses the point. We're talking about the most sustainable mines in the world in the Intermountain West, generally not near anyone. And you can't have your cake and eat it too. I mean, if you're going to diversify away from China, other allies, yep, that's a great start. But we need to be able to utilize our own. But to your ultimate question, yes. I mean, we want to encourage imports. I mean, having free trade allows for the most efficient deployment of capital possible, as long as it's coming with a certain modicum of standards. And I was tongue-in-cheek talking about worker safety, but I mean that's a big deal for a lot of the stuff that comes into this country from places around the world, including China. And it's something that doesn't get focused on a lot. So, I mean, when I say free trade, I don't mean absolute without any, soberness on where the things are coming from or what the conditions are. But having a vibrant import market is critical.
Look, I mean, international trade supports American jobs. Imports supports American jobs. Exports supports American jobs. We should be embracing all of that. And in particular, if we're talking about working with our allies, we should make trade easier between the United States and our allies. If that critical mineral extraction and processing is going to happen in one of our allies, let's make it faster to export those products to the United States, to get it into the hands of our manufacturers so they can use it, and then build it into a product and then export it somewhere else. And that is mutually beneficial to the United States, our allies, and other trading partners.
Couldn't have said it better myself. All right.
And we do have a question from our virtual audience. Appreciate your comments on tariffs being taxes on consumers. Do you feel the same way about carbon tariffs and CBAMs?
Same way about what?
Carbon tariffs and CBAMs.
There's certainly restraints on trade, that's for sure. If you look at what Europe is putting in place right now, it's a pickle. I would argue that it's not fair because it doesn't take into account the regulatory environment in which U.S. Businesses operate. It doesn't take into account our declining greenhouse gas intensity and frankly just net greenhouse gas reductions. And it puts Europe on a different plane than where the U.S. is, which is just it's not realistic. I do think that this is going to be a discussion over many years, and it's ultimately going to become, if it's not already, solely about China, and perhaps not even really about greenhouse gas reductions, but a backdoor way to justify a trade war with China. Going back to the previous question, we import a lot, we export a lot. And when you put barriers up, it hurts Americans who import and it hurts Americans who export. And I'm fearful that if you look at Europe's CBAM on top of its emissions trading system, on top of the new methane regulations, it's putting walls higher and higher around an economy in that the EU that's becoming less and less competitive. And that hurts us too. We need vibrant trading partners who can participate in the back and forth.
Great answer. Any other questions? We've got two still. Awesome.
If you have time for one more, I'm going to build on three things that were said and then ask a question. Free trade is good. This is the theme that I've heard across the board here. 2, need to be trading with allies. And 3, I think somebody mentioned in the very beginning USMCA. So what I'm taking away from a lot of this is, 1, free trade is good, but it's hard. No free trade agreements being done recently, but we've got this one that we have renegotiation coming up on. I'm curious, anybody have thoughts on the prospects for that particular negotiation coming up in the areas of improved investment in North America in the clean tech space, 2, trade, and 3, standards being an opportunity to get standards in, more harmonization under the USMCA renegotiation? Any of this possible?
First of all, I appreciate the question on USMCA. We need to be careful with our terminology here. This is not a renegotiation. USMCA has to undergo a 6-year review that's built into the agreement. And from what I understand, there are some early conversations happening within each of the USMCA partners. There's going to be working group meetings set up. I think industry broadly is going to be paying very close attention to the 6-year review of the USMCA, CUSMA, TMEC, depending on where you sit. And for example, Canada is already asking for stakeholder comment on the 6-year review of CUSMA. So this is a great opportunity for anyone who cares about this to provide their input. And certainly those standards issues will be part of the conversation. There are sectoral annexes to the USMCA on regulatory cooperation that I'm not quite sure they've been fully implemented at this point, but it hasn't been a priority yet for this administration, but we would certainly encourage them to make that a priority so that we can be more competitive across the board in North America.
Fantastic. Thank you guys so very much. I think the key takeaway might be free trade after this panel. But incredibly grateful for your insights. And with that, big round of applause for our panel.